I think we will start. So a very warm welcome to you all. For those who don't know me, my name is Simone Westerhuis and I am Managing Director at LGB & Co. We are a capital markets and investments firm, and we support the development of fast-growing companies who are addressing unmet needs in niche markets. We at LGB believe that the success of our corporate clients is critical to building long-term relations with our investors, a lot of who will be on our webinar today. So thank you very much for attending. Our investors, through our activities, are offered regular opportunities to invest with us in both debt and equity transactions. So if you would like to learn more about what we do, please get in touch with us. Our contact details will be available on the screen after today's presentation. So I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists today, who are brave enough to debate what the UK markets have in store for us in 2021. So first of all, I would like to introduce Helen Thomas. Helen is CEO of Blonde Money. She founded Blonde Money in 2014 to provide independent, sensible market commentary to institutional investors. She covers financial markets from a global macro perspective. And then we also have Ivan Sedgwick, who is our own investments director. He has served previously as a senior advisor to the equity division of Société Générale and was also managing director there in charge of equity sales in London. He also has worked at Morgan Stanley, Lazard and Schroders during his career. So I understand that Helen and Ivan will touch on various topics today, including people's changing interactions and the impacts of that on the system and companies, consumption trends, vaccines, inequality in society, popular frustration with governments, and governments' changing mentality. So lots of subjects to be covered today. Please feel free to put any questions you have along the way in the chat. We will let Helen and Ivan debate for about 30 minutes, and then we will address as many of the questions as we can in the last 15 minutes. So without further ado, Helen, over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Simone, and hello to you all. Thanks for joining, and thanks to LGB for the opportunity to look at what the world holds for us this year. I'm not going to talk for forever. Ivan and I are going to have a good discussion about what's going to be happening here. So let me first sketch out for you the big picture, because as Simone said, my business, it looks at the macro outlook. So what we're focused on is what is going to happen to the consumer. And the way that we're looking at this is such a big change has now occurred to the economy that it can't just look at some simple things like inflation or unemployment for indicators. We need something new. So what we're looking at Blonde Money is something we've called the velocity of people. And by that, we mean the interactions people are having within the system. Used to be physical, now, like today, it's more virtual. But how are those interactions going to happen that the physical side has been restricted? So the velocity of people, its impairment is going to weigh on the economy. That is going to have an impact on our habits, change the way we consume, and ultimately it's going to lead to changes in the way our governments deal with things, because this is a change to the whole world and the way in which we live and work, and therefore the way our governments respond will be different as well. So that's just a really big picture overview of how we're looking at things. I'm going to dig into a bit of these, and I'm sure Ivan is going to ask me some thoughts about that. But if I just start with the concept of the velocity of people, that is this is the one that people seem to think I mean people moving around the system. I don't mean that. I mean how they interact with one another. And because we're going to do so much more virtually and do less physically, that was something already taking place with the tech revolution. Of course, the pandemic has thrown it into sharp relief. And our argument is that new habits have now been formed. people's social circles are shrinking, the way that they consume, go out, enjoy their leisure time is all going to be very different going forward. Oh, this is what happens with the virtual world. Look, my lighting falls down. That's live television for you. Anyway, so these habits are going to change. We will, in fact, instead of me having a temporary light here, I'm going to end up with a house where one of the bedrooms becomes a studio, because actually this way that we all interact with one another is going to persist. I'm going to stop there. And Ivan, I know you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't really disagree with that. I suppose just for the coming year, once people are allowed to interact, there will surely be a massive bounce back, that people will want to go out to play, they will want to travel. And I suppose the danger there is that we think that there's just, well, this is great, it's just a return to normal, it's a return to how it was in the old days. And you know, you do see that in some old economy areas. I mean, we saw, I think, November construction activity in the UK had actually reached the level, exceeded the level of February, albeit there was a big component of government infrastructure spending in there. But you know, what happens in the immediate aftermath of everyone being vaccinated, starting presumably with people like my mother, age 85, whizzing around, socializing like mad. Now they've got the jab, may not be a good guide to what happens beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about the vaccines are really important, because we've all seen, of course, that, you know, stock markets have taken that with a lot of ebullience and a lot of excitement. I think for that to be sustained, we'd have to think that this vaccine rollout will be smooth, easy, happen everywhere at once, and there to be no bump in the road. That's obviously quite unrealistic, simply because governments are having to undertake the biggest vaccination program ever in real time as the virus is still with us. And the concern for me about the vaccine is that there are several concerns. Not for me personally, I'm perfectly happy to have a vaccine, but I mean that there is always going to be some lack of trust. I note that the French in particular have a national dislike of vaccines, which will of course slow the progress of vaccinating the country. And of course the virus does not respect borders. So I wonder we get into this sort of world of vaccine nationalism, where certain people can only travel to certain countries with a certain kind of vaccine. And not just it's not just that could be government mandated, it could be behavioral. So people start to hear that people with the Chinese vaccine go on holiday to Thailand, then they decide, I don't want to go there, I'd rather go to Menorca or whatever. But there certainly is not necessarily going to be this smooth transition to a post-vaccine world. And, you know, let alone, of course, unfortunately, the risk the virus mutates or indeed debilitating side effects, which, while very small in terms of the sample sizes, you know, we're hearing that these vaccines are 94% effective. But of course, when it comes down to actual numbers, that could be tens of thousands of people who do have an unfortunate side effect. Again, I'm not saying personally that affects me. I'm just saying that my thesis rests on fear. And I'm just not sure we get rid of the fear for a year or two, or in fact, several years, and that people's behavior will just have changed anyway, and will change the way that they operate.
Yes, and certainly as regards government attitudes, pandemics go from being something that was ticked on a risk register to something that's real. I mean, they always say that that armies always spend their time planning for the last war, and governments will now spend their time planning for what they say will be the next pandemic, arguably the last one. But there will surely be a permanent shift up in certainly developed governments like the UK is spending on life sciences. Certainly, we think that will be the case. It's not going to go back to where it was. The big vaccine centre the government's putting together in Oxfordshire, for example, is a we're seeing also, I think, a resumption of interest, of government interest in how it promotes activity in the life sciences. After all, the government in the UK particularly is both, it is the sponsor of research through the universities, which it pays for largely. It's the sponsor of trials through the NHS. It's also the major consumer of life sciences. So it sort of makes sense to try and put that all together. And clearly, if one can find companies that are going to do well out of that and be able to work with that, that will be interesting. But yeah, that fear has negative effect potentially on how people interact. It has positive effects in the way that governments redirect spending.
Yeah, no, it'd be interesting to see what happens to these vaccine passports that are being discussed, you know, that you might need to have something on that passport to travel. And you know, that's already happening in some countries. It's not too far to then expect that those health passports might include other diseases that some countries might want you to state you're free from. So you can kind of imagine that there's like these ID cards, and they have an imprint on them eventually of our health and our risk that we might pose when we travel around the world. Whether that's good or bad is, I think we can say that it will lead to a potential inequality, because inevitably the rich are going to be able to get whatever vaccinations they need, but beyond that, they will they tend to be likely to be healthier, just in terms of, you know, how economics relates to health. So there's something in here about, there's a lot of technology that's being developed, and the question is, you know, how will it be beneficial? How will it affect how people move around? But the concern I have is about inequality. I think a lot of what is taking place at the moment is stretching inequality, which had already been in place for about the last 20 years. I mean, globalization, there were winners and losers. Obviously, famously, you know, American car workers were losing their jobs. Then you got the banking crisis, where people felt they lost their pensions to the bankers. Now they're losing their freedom to a virus. The anger is ratcheting up, and the perceived inequalities are widening, and that makes governing very difficult. Yeah, sorry, Ivan.
Yeah, I mean, the inequality debate's very interesting because, I mean, very simplistically put, on a original inequality because of the enormous increase in prosperity in places like China, but in the West there's been an increase in inequality locally, which is a consequence of the increased prosperity of China. And surely that's only going to increase. I mean, the Chinese economy is growing again. The Far Eastern major economies and minor economies have come through the pandemic far better than the West. And you know, on some measures, China is already the largest economy. Certainly not on a per capita basis. But that structural shift in favor of the Pacific, in favor of Greater China, is, I don't think, going away. There's clearly going to be some big political complications to that, and it's, you know, it's not as simple as just saying, well, that's fine. Let's, you know, buy HSBC as a play on China, because HSBC finds itself absolutely stuck in the middle of a sort of political crunch. But you know, this is way outside of what LGB does in terms of investments. But I think more generally, it just gets harder and harder to avoid the conclusion that what, you know, that this is going to stay a very big part of people's investment world.
Yeah, and my thinking about the inequality angle, and, you know, look, I have no political axe to grind one way or the other. A lot of the work we're doing is to be entirely politically neutral, because, you know, markets don't care about the politics in that sense. They only care really what does it mean for economic outcomes. But where I'm interested in this is the mantra of whatever it takes, because we've had that from every leader over the last year, very understandably. They needed to reassure the public, and they have done a lot. They've done an awful lot. You know, obviously here in Britain, the furlough scheme will have been operational for over a year, and as it stands, may well even be extended. That's a huge government intervention. But how long can a government credibly commit to doing whatever it takes? There is, of course, a cost eventually to the huge amount of debt that's being incurred. And it gets paid for one way or the other down the line with either taxes, less spending, or inflation. You know, it's just a question of when, really.
I mean, taking a sort of brief excursion, does populism re-manifest itself perhaps from the left rather than from the right? You know, this argument that Marcus Rashford is actually the most effective leader of the opposition at the moment, and yet, you know, an extremely well-paid footballer campaigning for free food for children is a populist move, and one incredibly hard for governments to resist. And we've talked a lot about populism from the right, but populism is in a way politically neutral, and it's facilitated by the internet, by Twitter, by modern communication methods more generally. Anyway, I sort of throw that out there. I'm not sure that has any particular investment of them.
I think it has the investment implication about this concept of whatever it takes, because it's fine when everybody's getting free money, but as soon as it, you know, as soon as the resources start to shrink, which they are doing because GDP is shrinking and the government can't do this forever, then that's when you have to make the hard choices. And inevitably the hard choices, there are big winners and big losers, both politically and economically. And so I think it will affect how people invest. There's a very big picture question of taxation regimes and where you might want to put your money, because you know, in the UK anyway, there's talk of, you know, CGT tax increases, etc. In the US, there's talk of regulation of big tech, which would be a really interesting one to see if this Biden administration really does pursue that. Because on the one hand, you feel like everybody's agreed that tech is, you know, they're so big and so powerful, they are basically almost monopolies or oligopolies. You know, they're just too dominant, and they don't do everything that's great. But on the other hand, they have been a huge driver of American growth. It would be maybe, some would argue, you know, killing the golden goose if they were to regulate it.
The big tech companies are, after all, also relatively friendly to the Democrats.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I think it'll take a while to regulate them properly. I think this question of sort of tax and government support is very interesting. If you go back to the global financial crisis, certainly as it played out in Europe, yes, the governments were there to rescue the banks. Bank shares from the low point recovered quite strongly in the year or so afterwards, but essentially they're where they were then. I mean, they have not been good investments. The support stopped them going bust, but it didn't. You know, governments, once they were solvent again, had no further interest in restoring them to health. Big companies are being stopped from going bust, have been stopped from going bust. That doesn't mean that the government's going to be there to bail them out of their pension deficits, which are going to be sitting around their neck for years, or necessarily to recapitalize and get rid of their debt burdens. And people talk about the K-shaped recovery, i.e. some things do recover quite strongly, but other things just deteriorate. Yeah, assuming that government benevolence lasts for longer than it has to, I think is probably misguided. So I think what we may see in the bigger parts of the economy, in the older parts of the economy, is we've already had quite a big snapback. That snapback potentially continues, but at the end of it, there's the hangover. As you say, the government support measures peter out, and companies are left with big debts, and with permanently damaged business models. And
well, yeah, I mean, there are some. This is one of those moments in history where everything changes, and therefore some companies will not survive. I mean, we have been used to that over the years anyway. Household names just disappear. One thing, therefore, that I'm interested in this year is, because there's a sense that there's like a zombification going on, that these big debt companies that don't really work anymore just keep on life support, thanks to low interest rate and government bailouts, etc. But I think that the chickens can home to roost a bit sooner, when it comes to that vaccine rollout. Because when we get to a point where, let's say in the autumn in the UK, the government believes most adults will have been vaccinated, maybe 60% of the population is done then, they will want to pull back from any further support. So in a sense, the market wasn't able to price the recession last year because of all the money that was thrown at it. It could, we think, be the case that when the vaccine rollout is complete, that's when you see the recession emerge. That's when the layoffs actually happen, because the government won't continue to keep everyone on furlough when the vaccines are done, because they'll say, well, now you're free and easy to go about your business. If you're not commuting into the city every day and going to that local sandwich shop, well, maybe it's just not going to be around any longer. And that will be very difficult. And imagine the pressure on the government when that kind of thing actually happens.
There's also, I suppose, the sort of creative destruction, that companies, that businesses can re-emerge in old sectors, but not necessarily under the same ownership. We got shown a couple of months ago, and we didn't get involved because it was sort of outside our usual area. We got shown quite an interesting business, which was someone was setting a business up to buy essentially bankrupt nightclubs in London, and because the previous owners were gone, and there will be opportunities. That's surely going to be the case in the hospitality sector, that just because people will want to go out and eat and stay in hotels, that doesn't mean that the current hotel and restaurant owners are still going to be in business to provide that.
I think it's quite an interesting angle that when we travel in the future, we might not want to be in massive hotels where we run the risk of bumping into a lot more people. I think there's already a hotel in Singapore that repurposed itself as a luxury quarantine center. Some of the bigger hotels have the space to give people more of that space to be hermetically sealed off from other people. It's why I think the Airbnb IPO is quite interesting, because obviously it looked disastrous for them. But if in the future we don't really want to go to hotels, we might just want to go to somewhere it's just our family somewhere. And indeed, we might travel more domestically, given things like requirements for vaccine passports to go abroad. I could see actually, Airbnb as an example doing all right.
Well, there's an emerging business in refitting cruise liners to seriously to COVID-proof them.
Yes.
But,
yeah. Well. So, because here's the thing: it's not just about COVID. We will still have COVID. Unfortunately, we still have the Spanish flu. We still have measles and rubella and all these other things that we're fortunate don't affect us so much here. But there'll still be the flu and a number of other potentially debilitating illnesses. I think hygiene tourism becomes something that is the way that hospitality works. But I'm interested in the point about the nightclubs, because here's the other thing. We've talked a lot about COVID and the big structural shifts this year, but there were many trends that were already in place. Local pubs were already closing. Ever since you could get your 4 cans of beer for £5 at the supermarket, people didn't seem to be so fussed about going down the pub. Millennials, we hear, are more interested in going to the gym than the pub. I don't know if people on this call would agree with that or not. Certainly some of the surveys that were done during the first lockdown had people's number one desire was to get their hair cut, which I think all of us are starting to be somewhat concerned about this time around. But well above going to the pub was going to the gym. You know, there is supposedly a more health conscious generation. So I think when it comes to things like hospitality and leisure and the sectors that can benefit, it has to be those that, yeah, can pick up failing spaces that might not be required anymore. One area that I really do find an interest in is virtual reality, which is still quite a small segment of, you know, in 10 years' time, that could well have shifted so that, you know, instead of me talking down my camera to you, we're all in a virtual boardroom, or actually, let's not do the boardroom, let's meet on the beach by a fake bar in Hawaii, and so, you know, we'll have real drinks delivered to ourselves we can have while we're chatting. But I think that could well be, you know, the long-term future. I think we have to think creatively. You know, the way we have fun is different now from 50 years ago, which was different to 50 years before that. Doesn't mean people won't want to still physically meet. Obviously they will, but it just, anything that shifts how they do it is going to incrementally affect some companies' business plans.
Yeah, it's quite hard to find ways of playing this. I mean, with virtual reality, augmented reality, there's a small investment trust that that we've introduced to some clients, but it is very small. And in some other emerging bits of the economy, in cell-grown meat, for example, again, the only way, certainly in the UK, of playing that has been through a venture fund, because there certainly aren't big companies or even small companies quoted at the moment. But one just has to look out for the ways in, and they may not be obvious ones.
What about cars as one that will shift? I mean, I think you know, electric cars again, it was a trend already in place. You've now got governments mad keen to do loads of infrastructure spending, so there's a great thing they could put their money into. A more health conscious world, we're all you know, clearly more focused on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was on something called the Public Members Board of Network Rail about 8 years ago, and even then people were beginning to say, you know, are we actually backing the wrong technology here? As a train enthusiast, I really hope not. The Tesla is a different, you know, it's a different discussion. I think there's an interesting question as to what extent the conventional car manufacturers will be able to catch up on this sort of technology. But there's some quite interesting ways into the hydrogen economy, which we've certainly got more involved in over the last year or so. There are, you know, 3 decent sized fuel cell companies quoted in the UK, and there's a lot of other companies involved. I mean, AB Dynamics, for example, on the automated driving technology. So there are certainly ways into that, and there will be more ways. What we'll also see is, I think, the conventional energy companies themselves trying to greenwash their business. And just today there was a headline that Total had spent 2.5 billion in India on a solar power business. A couple of years ago, I remember Patrick Puyana at Chatham House talking about how the only important thing was just to up the consumption of natural gas. That was the way to deal with the carbon crisis. That's not what they're saying anymore, not what he's saying anymore. The big energy, which after all, for the big part of the UK market, you know, Shell and BP remain absolute giants. Which way are they going to go? And I think one of the things that they will do is that they will spend money on finding ways into emerging technology. And in the same way that the big drug companies buy biotech companies, they wait for the thing to be proven and then they buy into it. That Facebook and Google do the same with tech, emerging tech businesses. They wait till the thing's been proven with other people's money, and they're then willing to pay up. But I think we will see conventional energy companies spending money on the new energy technologies, and there will certainly be ways of playing that within the market, and certainly things that we will look for. Meanwhile, just as a coda on that, there is still a colossal amount of private equity money around, and private equity is not subject to the same ESG criteria that public funds are. And I'm also sure that we will start seeing private equity starting to take on carbon economy businesses and just say, well, fine, we can run these for cash out of the public gaze, and we're not bothered. We don't care whether you like this or not, because we don't have to. So there's going to be there's going to be a sort of twin pressure there.
Well, private equity is just, the industry that keeps on going, isn't it? Over all these years and decades of crises, and there's always been, existential threat looming, but actually they've just done better and better. And, clearly on a big picture, they've been a beneficiary of the lower and lower interest rates and the money that's ends up sloshing around the system.